Unit 4. Exercise 1. Let's start with the statement, humans are causing climate change by burning fossil fuels. It is the basis upon which people all over the world, including me, are calling for the rapid end to fossil fuel use and the transition to carbon emission-free energy sources. It's a pretty bold statement, and it is very different from saying that the climate is changing, what scientists call detection. If we are going to argue for a massive change in human society, which is what will be required to end our use of fossil fuels, it seems reasonable to ask that we move beyond detection. After all, fossil fuels, despite their problems, have provided tremendous benefits to society over the 20th century. If we, the climate-concerned public, are going to insist that we stop using fossil fuels, it is incumbent upon us to prove that the downside is greater than the very real upside that fossil fuels have offered. We need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that climate is changing and that human use of fossil fuels, not something else, is responsible for the climate change we are observing. We need attribution in addition to detection. Exercise 2. The grammatical structure of a language is a social fact in Durkheim's sense of being external to and constraining for individual speakers. It is independent of their subjective preferences, and they must follow the rules if they are to be understood. However, the grammatical rules of gender, agreement, number, subject and object, possessive, and so on are not, in general, consciously followed and applied by the individuals who speak to each other. Speakers typically have only a very limited and partial awareness of the rules of their own grammar, and speaking grammatically is a matter of unreflective habit rather than conscious rule following. The grammatical rules of a language, then, do not exist apart from the minds of the individual speakers. They may be formulated in a book of grammar, but such a book records the grammar more or less imperfectly and does not comprise the grammar. The rules that are followed in forming a correct utterance and a well-organized discourse exist only in the minds of the individual speakers as learned dispositions held in the neurophysiological memory traces of their brains. Exercise 3. When environment involves human interests, it must necessarily be understood in relation to humans and not as an assemblage of independent objects. We can find support for this in the work of social psychologists such as Kurt Lewin and J.J. Gibson. Lewin envisioned a social world comprised of vectors of force between participants and the things and conditions with which they interact. These vectors invite particular behaviors, and this led Lewin to call them by the German term Affordungsqualitäten, translated into English as invitational qualities. More recently, the perceptual psychologist J.J. Gibson studied the ways in which the design and appearance of environmental configurations and objects encourage particular responses in human behavior. He called these connections affordances for behavior clearly influenced by Lewin's terminology and resembling his observations. The work of Lewin and Gibson is important and instructive, for it suggests that environment is not just open space filled with arrangements of independent objects, but rather is a field of forces in compelling relationships of attraction, repulsion, and neutrality or indifference. Environment is, then, a field that includes the human participant. Exercise 4. As many journalism scholars have argued, print-era journalists rejected audience research because doing so was one of the only means to protect their always unstable professional status. Sociologist Andrew Abbott has characterized professions as somewhat exclusive groups of individuals applying somewhat abstract knowledge to particular cases. Although it is commonly categorized as a profession, journalism has long struggled to comfortably inhabit this definition. Even before the rise of the Internet helped shift institutional gatekeeping power away from news organizations and toward technology platforms, journalists had difficulty establishing themselves as a somewhat exclusive group of individuals. Indeed, while traditional professions such as medicine and law rely on strict licensing requirements to limit entry into the profession, the First Amendment prohibits U.S. journalism from establishing any such thing. Nor can journalists lay a strong claim to jurisdiction over a form of abstract knowledge. As journalism scholar Matt Carlson has argued, abstraction makes for bad journalism. Clarity, especially in the explanation of complex topics, makes for good journalism. The accessibility of journalistic language is helpful for informing the public, but it also renders journalists' claims to specialized expertise potentially suspect. Exercise 5. Management, especially of anything as complex as a transportation system, is very difficult. There are often many different organizations involved, each of which has multiple divisions with multiple levels of authority and often many lengthy written procedure manuals. To make matters worse, the manuals are seldom kept up to date and, in any event, cannot possibly consider every combination of factors that might occur. During the incident, the people responsible for maintaining control, the pilots in most commercial aviation incidents, waste valuable time studying the different manuals, trying to find the relevant case. Modern computer systems attempt to help by automatically diagnosing the situation and either responding autonomously or offering operators the instructions to be followed. But the diagnosis or recommended course of action is not always appropriate because in each complex situation, most accidents involve different unique factors. Different organizations might be involved: police and firefighters, company safety representatives, multiple teams from different divisions of a company, and different companies or government and regulatory agencies who must coordinate their decisions and actions. It is rare that the result is smooth, flawless management. Exercise 6. Age is not the only determinant of spatial skills. While 13-year-old children have all the cognitive attributes they need to be proficient at wayfinding, some are better than it than others. By this point, parental attitudes, freedom of movement, cognitive differences, and life experience have already begun to leave their imprint, and they never ease off. All of us may be explorers when we're born, but few of us stay that way. We end up suppressing our childish natures, slipping into routines, and following the routes we always take. A recent study by Canadian psychologists found that 84% of 8-year-olds navigate by scrutinizing their surroundings and building a mental map, a so-called spatial strategy that is also used by almost all competent adult navigators. The alternative is a more closed, egocentric strategy which entails learning and following a sequence of turns. Only 46% of us still use the spatial approach in our 20s and 39% in our 60s. It seems that we all start off wandering free, but most of us end up on the straight and narrow. Life has a way of clipping our wings. Exercise 7. The bird songs we hear every day are more than beautiful. They serve a practical purpose. Birds employ their voices to call their mates, find their flocks, claim territory, scare off intruders, warn others about predators, and for countless other functions. For instance, Japanese and Swiss researchers recently discovered that Japanese great tits, small birds with jet black heads and necks with prominent white cheeks, use syntax in their songs, just as humans do in their speech. Syntax is crucial to language. For example, if you say, "I love that restaurant," the message is clear. But not even Star Wars Master Yoda could understand "Restaurant love that I." Until recently, scientists believed that only humans could string together such vocalizations. The Japanese great tit, it turns out, is the first animal apart from humans who can use phonological syntax, the ability to combine sounds that individually have no meaning into a collective sound that does. To instruct other members of his flock to scan for predators or to attract a mate, a great tit must sing several distinct notes in the correct order. If the notes are sung differently, the found other birds will not react. Exercise 8. When an organism is confronted with some sort of threat, it typically becomes vigilant, searches to gain information about the nature of the threat, struggles to find an effective coping response. And once a signal indicates safety, the lion has been evaded, the traffic cop buys the explanation and doesn't issue a ticket, the organism can relax. But this is not what occurs in an anxious individual. Instead, there is a nervous scrambling among coping responses, abruptly shifting from one to another without checking whether anything has worked, an agitated attempt to cover all the bases, and attempt a variety of responses simultaneously. Or there is an inability to detect when the safety signal occurs, and the restless vigilance keeps going. By definition, anxiety makes little sense outside the context of what the environment is doing to an individual. In that framework, the brain chemicals and, ultimately, the genes relevant to anxiety don't make you anxious. They make you more responsive to anxiety-provoking situations, make it harder to detect safety signals in the environment. Exercise 9. Babies use statistical learning to make predictions about the world, guiding their actions. Like little statisticians, they form hypotheses, assess probabilities based on their knowledge, integrate new evidence from the environment, and perform tests. In one creative study by the developmental psychologist Fei Xu, 10 to 14-month-old children first expressed a preference for pink or black lollipops, then were shown two candy jars, one containing more black lollipops than pink, and one with more pink than black. The experimenter then closed her eyes and drew one lollipop from each jar so infants could see only the stick, not the color. Each lollipop was placed into a separate opaque cup with only the stick showing. Infants crawled to the cup that was statistically more likely to contain their preferred color because it came from a jar where that color was in the majority. Experiments like this demonstrate that infants are not merely reactive to the world, even from a very young age. They actively estimate probabilities based on patterns that they observe and learn to maximize the outcomes they desire. Exercise 10. David Howes, a professor of anthropology, notes the frequent association in different cultures between sense and rituals of transition, such as funerals or rites of passage. He suggests that scent is felt to be symbolically appropriate for moments of social transition because it so frequently accompanies and marks other types of physical transition, as when cooking smells signal the transformation of raw ingredients into food. While scents tend to escape spaces and spread out of human control, our experience of them is frequently liminal, as we notice scents far more strongly when first entering their range. You smell baking bread strongly as you enter a house, but after a few minutes inside, you may no longer be able to smell it, even with deliberate effort, a physical process known as olfactory adaptation or exhaustion. It takes an overwhelming smell to retain our notice after a period of constant exposure. Smells signal transitions through space as well as changes of state, and are thus used to mark socially important moments of change. Exercise 11. Variability in judgment is expected and welcome in a competitive situation in which the best judgments will be rewarded. When several companies or several teams in the same organization compete to generate innovative solutions to the same customer problem, we don't want them to focus on the same approach. The same is true when multiple teams of researchers attack a scientific problem, such as the development of a vaccine. We very much want them to look at it from different angles. Even forecasters sometimes behave like competitive players. The analyst who correctly calls a recession that no one else has anticipated is sure to gain fame, whereas the one who never strays from the agreement remains unnoticed. In such settings, variability in ideas and judgments is again welcome, because variation is only the first step. In a second phase, the results of these judgments will be pitted against one another, and the best will triumph. In a market, as in nature, selection cannot work without variation. Exercise 12. Intelligent failures begin with preparation. No scientist wants to waste time or materials on experiments that have been run before and failed. Do your homework. The classic intelligent failure is hypothesis-driven. You've taken the time to think through what might happen, why you have reason to believe that you could be right about what will happen. My Harvard colleague, Thomas Eisenman, an entrepreneurship expert, finds that many startup failures are caused by the skipping of basic homework. For example, Triangulate, an online dating startup, rushed to launch fully functional offerings that didn't fit any market needs. Eager to launch fast, founders skipped the research, customer interviews to probe for unmet needs. Paying no attention to that crucial preparation, the company paid the price. Thomas attributes this common failure in part to the fail fast mantra, which overemphasizes action, shortchanging preparation. Moreover, while this might seem self-evident, once you've done the homework, you must pay attention to what it's telling you.